All right. Um, let's talk a little bit about some other really useful methods we can put in. We've talked about getters and setters. So, what are some other common methods that you'll see? Obviously, there's going to be a ton of different methods that are very specific to the class, but there's some that you're going to see a lot across classes. And those are the ones I wanted to focus on here. So, one is the toString method. Now, it's kind of what it sounds like. It takes your object and it converts it to a string. Well, why do we need that? Well, what I'm doing right here, I've made these circle objects right here, and then I printed them. Not the radius of the circle. I'm printing the whole circle. Like here's circ. I'm going to print circ. Well, let's see what happens when I do that. Wait, what? What does that even mean? Well, obviously, it shows the name of the class that that object belongs to, and so it's actually showing a location in memory, is what it's doing. And this is mostly useless to us. So, as is, printing an object doesn't really help. It can help to see that two objects are different because if they're the same, they will have the same address. Um, okay, but otherwise, not too helpful. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a toString method. Now, the object class already gave us a toString method, which is why we were able to print the object to begin with, because we're actually a subclass of the object class. Any class that you make is a subclass of the object method. And so we can use stuff like its toString method without even making one. But in this case, it's not very helpful. So we make our own toString method. It takes no parameters, it returns a string. And basically what we did is we put all of the information that we wanted to print out and we put it in this string. So circle with radius, whatever. What should you put in your toString? Well, it's just whatever you think you need. So now when I try to print these, I get this much more useful string printed. Okay. So I like to use this a lot, especially when I know I'm going to be tinkering around with stuff and I want to see what happened. Did the object change the way that I wanted it to change? For example, if I use a setter real quick, okay, circ.setRadius 5, and when I run it, you can see that the object changed the way I wanted it to change. So you can make a bunch of changes and then print the object and see, oh yeah, it made the changes I want, or oh no, it didn't do what I wanted, and so you can go back and change it a little more easily. Okay, so that's a toString method. It basically allows you to print your object. The next one we're going to look at is the equals method. Now, the equals method should look familiar. We used it for strings. Remember, you can't do equals equals when it comes to objects. Okay, that's only primitives. So instead, we're going to do this equals method. And the good news is the equals method is also a part of the object class. So let's see what happens. Now, I compared circ to circ2. So I compared a circle with radius 10 to another circle with radius 10, and it said they're not the same. Because they're not. They're not the same. They're two different objects. And so the built-in equals method says, no, they're not the same. If I put in the exact same object, it'll do what it's supposed to do. It'll say, hey, those are equal. For most practical purposes, though, that's not what we're looking for when I say that two objects are equal. Like in the case of two circles, they're going to be identical as long as the circle has the same radius. But Java doesn't know that, okay? So what I have to do is I have to overload this method and give my own criteria on what it means for it to be equal. Now, equals, just like the one for strings, should return either true or false. So my return type is Boolean. And you compare your object to another object of the same type. So I'm comparing circles to some other circle. And how do I want to compare it? Well, I want to return true if they have the same radius and false if they don't. So now, when I run this again, it says that they are the same, these two that have the same radius. And the ones that don't have the radius, okay, circ and circ3, it's saying that that's false. They're not the same. Finally, just like strings, we can do a compareTo method. Now, what this allows us to do is it allows us to create sort of a less than or greater than for objects. And the main reason this becomes useful later is we're going to make lists, okay, or arrays of these objects. And we're going to want to sort these arrays so that they're in a particular order. Well, what does it mean for these objects to be in order? What does it mean that this object comes before this object? Well, that's something that we have to define. And if you remember, the compareTo method for strings either returned a 0 if they were equal, returned a negative if the one we were acting on was less, and it returned something greater than 0 if the one that we are acting on is bigger. Now, with the string compareTo, there were all sorts of positives and negatives that it would return. Most of the time when we define one of these, we're just going to say that if it's bigger, return a positive 1. If it's less than, return negative 1. If they're equal, return 0. Sometimes it's meaningful to go beyond that and put other values there, but generally that's what we want to do, especially because it has to be an int. So I don't want to put like the difference between the two radiuses because that's going to be a double. Okay, but compareTo has to return an int for us to use it later because there's a specific method that it's going to be looking for later when we sort. So it has to be compareTo, it has to return an int, and it has to take this other object as a parameter. So how am I setting mine up? Exactly the way you would think. I say, hey, if the radius is bigger, return positive. If the radius is smaller, return negative. If they have the same radius, return 0. Now, ideally, you want your compareTo method to be consistent with equals. Consistent with equals means that if you're returning 0, then your equals method should be returning true. And if you're not returning 0, then your equals method should be returning false. So that's not required that your compareTo method be consistent like that, but it makes it a lot simpler and a lot more intuitive if you can manage to do that. Again, it doesn't always make sense to do that, but ideally, that is what you want to see. So let's compare circ to circ2. Now, these are equal, so it should give us 0. And it does. It wasn't greater than 0. It wasn't less than 0. It was equal to 0. So there we go. If I compare to circ3 instead, it should have a larger radius. So it should give us something greater than 0. And it did. Okay. Since it was greater than 0, it said it had a bigger radius. So toString lets us print. Equals lets us check if two objects are equal. compareTo is going to let us sort our objects later. It kind of defines a less than, greater than. And we're going to use these in a lot of different classes. So I hope that all made sense to you.